I stand poisoned by religion and decisions of sin. As television spins the lies of white men, I see no friends. As the media sends the myth of the truth to fear my brown skin. So let me begin with my fallen kin. When the panic of the frantic killed Americans, now eyes of despisers surrounded the lies. As bombs terminate the end of human lives, while the husbands and wives and suburban lives lock all the doors and remain terrorized. So I must comply to the FBI. I'm a suspect who was subject to my ethnic ties. Still American born, my heart remains torn to my people who are equal all around the world. Cause the hordes of war are beating the drum, hidden in the sins and lies for freedom. So stand up, son, because we have no time. An eye for an eye makes the world go blind. Peace and blessings. How you all doing today? Thank you very much, Jesse, for having me here. It's really an honor to be here at LaSalle College. I want to greet you in the Islamic greeting of peace. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you. This is the greeting of peace that Muslims, people who identify with the religion of Islam, greet one another with throughout the world. When we greet one another, of the 1.7 billion Muslims on this planet, when we greet one another, we typically use this greeting. We greet each other in peace. And we refer to each other as brothers and sisters. Because we consider ourselves part of a global community of brothers and sisters striving for peace. So, you know, in the world that we're living in today, it feels like there's just like a million issues to talk about. And so all of a sudden it seems like the fact that there's like a travel ban on Muslims and there's like all these things, racial profiling and discrimination that's going on and hate crimes that's being directed towards Muslims, it's almost getting like lost in the shuffle at this point. So I think it's really important to take some time to learn and understand some of the issues of Islamophobia in our country and beyond. And Islamophobia is not just an issue of the people who identify with the religion of Islam. Islamophobia is also about racism. And it's about particularly those who are perceived as Muslims. And so many of the people who are subject to the implications of Islamophobia may not even identify with the religion of Islam. So we'll talk about that a little bit along the way today. I'm sorry that I'm up here above you all, but I got to be near this computer. So how many of you feel like you don't know very much about the religion of Islam? Okay, a good number of you. All right, so we'll start with the basics. Now, I want to be really clear. I'm not a religious scholar. I'm here to give you social, cultural, historical, and political context about Islamophobia. But I do think it's important to get some basic information about the religion of Islam, which I'll share now. How many of you have heard of the 5 pillars of Islam? Okay, a good number of you. Okay, that's a good, see, y'all know some things, okay? All right, that's good, it's a good start. Are you awake? Hello? Yeah. Did you all just have lunch or something? It's all right to be like, alive and, enjoying yourselves. So first and foremost, for the absolute most important thing in the Islamic tradition is faith and declaration in the oneness of Allah, Allah being the Arabic word for God. So if you're an Arabic speaker, no matter what your faith tradition is, if you're referring to God, you use the word Allah, right? But in the Islamic tradition, Allah is referring to the God of Abraham, right? So we as an Islamic tradition consider ourselves an Abrahamic faith and believe that Muhammad, peace be upon him, is his prophet. Now, to be a Muslim, all it takes is to be able to declare this. It's known as the Shahada. Now, if you can declare this through your own free will, you're a Muslim. That's it. Everything after that is about living into that belief, right? Which is what the rest of the pillars are about. And it's also important to understand that of all the different understandings of Islam throughout the world, essentially what everybody agrees upon for the most part are these pillars, okay, throughout the world. Daily prayer, so you may know practicing Muslims, and there are 5 main times of prayer, once in the morning, twice in the afternoon, once at sunset, and once at night. It's important for Muslims to have clean and safe space to be able to fulfill this religious obligation, as well as some time to be able to fulfill this in their educational and work environments. How many of you have heard of Ramadan? Okay, everybody, that's good. So Ramadan is the holiest month of the Islamic calendar. The Islamic calendar is a lunar calendar, which is about 10 days shorter than the Western solar calendar. So it gets a little bit earlier each year. Right now it falls in June, which means the days are really long.
which is challenging because we abstain from eating and drinking from sunrise to sunset each day during Ramadan. And we do so because Ramadan is considered a time of deep reflection, of prayer. It is a time in which we are thinking about the plight of those who don't have easy access to food and water. So it's a time of empathy. And so therefore we have the experience of what it's like to deny ourselves food and water, to try to feel that reality, and also to recognize that our life is dependent on a creator giving us food and water in order to be able to live. And that's kind of tied to the next pillar known as zakat, or charity. Muslims are required to give a percentage of their wealth away each year. And it can be done at any time of year, but many people choose to do it in a time during the time of Ramadan, because it's a time where you're particularly thinking about the plight of the needy. And this idea is about creating a social safety net in a society, right? So it's not just about your individual belief, it's about your responsibility to your fellow human being. And then finally, if you're physically and economically able to do so, a pilgrimage to Mecca at some time in your life. And I've been fortunate enough to have done this, and you'll find millions of people from all over the planet converging in modern-day Saudi Arabia, and everybody's wearing a white cloth. And this symbolizes the idea that no matter how rich or poor you are, the idea is that we're all equal in the eyes of our Creator. And so these egalitarian principles are at the core of the Islamic tradition. No matter, in our way we pray and so forth and so on, the idea is that we don't have unnecessary hierarchies, and instead the idea is that we're all just equal. And then basic concepts about the religion. Jesus is considered to be the second to last prophet in the Islamic tradition. Moses, Noah, Isaac, Ishmael, these are all prophets mentioned in our Holy Scripture known as the Quran. So people who are familiar with Judeo-Christian tradition would be very familiar with a lot of these concepts and ideas and stories that are mentioned in our Holy Scripture. And Jesus is incredibly important. There's a belief in a virgin birth. There's a whole chapter about Mary. Again, it's not that unfamiliar. So if you look at what you see through media, you see a really distorted representation of Islam, and you don't necessarily realize that most Muslims are following a religion that isn't actually that different from a number of other Judeo-Christian traditions. And then a basic concept is that your works matter. There's a belief that we all do good deeds and bad deeds, and there's a belief in the day of judgment, and that on that day, our Creator will determine our life in the hereafter, life after this life. There's a belief in a heaven and a hell. Again, all of these things are not that unfamiliar to most people living in this country. So, I want to get into some myths that exist about the religion. At this point, it's really important to make a distinction between what a religion teaches and what people do, right? People do all different kinds of things in the name of religion, and they have their subjective lens, they have their rationalizations, they have their justifications. And then there's just what a religion teaches. And so when I'm sharing this, I'm not here to justify every single last thing in the world that people do in the name of Islam that may or may not be okay. I'm just trying to share with you some concepts of the religion as I understand them and as most people understand them at their core. Now, I'm not a woman, and so I don't want to speak on behalf of Muslim women, but it's important for you to know because there's lots of perceptions around women's rights in the Islamic tradition, and there's legitimately real undermining of women's rights in different parts of the world. But you should also know that the Islamic tradition gave rights to women over 1,400 years ago that only came into Western civilization in the last 100 years at best. So the first Islamic civilizations, over 1,400 years ago, women had the right to vote. In addition, a lot of rights were guaranteed through marriage. An Islamic marriage is known as nikah. It is a legal agreement, it's a contract between two free-willed individuals. It's supposed to be, at least. One should not be forced into marriage, even though it does occur in different places in the world. And how many of you are familiar with dowry? Okay, all right, good. Now, in most cultures, dowry is a set of wealth from the woman or the woman's family to the man or the man's family. In the Islamic tradition, it's the exact opposite. It's a set of wealth from the man or the man's family to the woman. And what that does is that it establishes personal property rights for women, and it means that it's a form of protection. First of all, should the marriage end, and whether the person's widowed or if there's a divorce. So Islam permits divorce. It's not encouraged, but it's permissible, which is not true in every religion. But then also, there's also again, it's a form of protection. So should the marriage end, that person takes that wealth with them. But even during the marriage, they can do whatever they want with that, and they do not have to share it with anybody, including they can start a business with it, whatnot. And when we see people undermining women's rights in different places in the world, we see them flying in the face of one of the most prominent examples we have in the Islamic tradition. So after our Holy Scripture, the Quran, the first thing that we look to is the life of Prophet Muhammad. And his wife, Khadija, was the wealthiest woman in all of Mecca. She had a trade business, and she was his boss. He used to run caravans for her trade business, and she asked him to marry her. And so this powerful example, this woman named Khadija, is a tremendous example of a powerful, dynamic Muslim woman. And she was the first Muslim woman. And so when we see people in places like Afghanistan undermining women's rights and preventing women from going to school and so forth and so on, we see that they're actually flying in the face of the most prominent example we could possibly have, right? And so that's the kind of contradictions that we see between basic aspects of what we see as almost self-evident in what the religion actually teaches with what's happening out, what's playing out in various places in the world. Now, the big elephant in the room about Islam is a perception that it's violent. It's a violent religion. Now, our response as Muslims is that, no, Islam means peace. By definition, it means peace through the submission to God, right? That's what it actually means. But many people point to this concept of jihad. What do we normally hear that jihad means in our media?
Holy war.
Holy war, right? They say that it means holy war. Does jihad mean holy war? No. Does anybody know what jihad translates to in English?
Struggle?
Struggle, that's correct. So, why does that matter? Okay. There's two types of jihad. There's a greater jihad and a lesser jihad. The greater jihad is a spiritual struggle to navigate the moral and ethical dilemmas of daily life, to be God conscious and to make good choices, right? And then the lesser jihad is a more physical interpretation of the term. And the idea is that when one is under attack, you have the right to defend yourself, your family, your community. Now, I want you to think about our laws here in the United States. Is the penalty for murder and self-defense the same as premeditated murder? No, right? It's the exact same concept, right? What cannot be justified, and overwhelmingly the vast majority of scholars, Islamic scholars throughout the world agree, what cannot be justified under this concept of jihad are unprovoked, premeditated attacks, especially against non-combatants, right? And so what we see are in different parts of the world are extremists who are manipulating and using certain kind of political agendas and rationales to justify their actions, even though overwhelmingly it is agreed and understood that this is actually not permissible. There's also a perception that Islam is anti-Semitic. And when I say this, a negative attitude towards Jewish people, even though Arab people are actually Semitic people, so it's actually not an accurate term, but whatever, that's the term that we use here in the United States. So a lot of people point to places like Israel and Palestine, and they say, you know, it's an unresolvable conflict. Muslims and Jews have been fighting for hundreds and hundreds of years. It's never going to end. Anybody who says that to you has no idea what they're talking about. Islamic civilizations consistently protect Jewish people from persecution, typically by European Christians. So time and time again, whether you want to talk about Spain, Morocco, Turkey, even what is now called Israel and Palestine, you have that consistently. You have that history, and I want to show you how recent that history is, as recent as World War II.
It's a story you've likely never heard. One told through the faces of these Albanian Muslims who risked their lives to live by a code of faith and honor called Besa.
We are going to protect anybody who asks for our help and come to that, and we're promising to take care of them and help.
The exhibit is opening eyes throughout the world.
You don't have to share the same faith, you have to respect each other's faith.
Pictures of Albanian Muslims tell a lifetime of stories. This man hid Jewish families, saying, "I did nothing special. All Jews are our brothers." The head of the Bektashti sect, with more than 7 million followers, tells the story of Albania's prime minister, who gave a secret order during the Nazi occupation. He said, all Jewish children will sleep with your children, all will eat the same food, all will live as one family.
They were among the people who, at great personal risk, sheltered Jews and protected them in their homes, and did so out of a religious obligation.
In post-World War II Europe, it is said Albania is the only country to boast a greater number of Jews than before the Holocaust. The Islamic Foundation of Greater St. Louis and several local Jewish agencies hope the St. Louis community will experience this rare look at the role Albanian Muslims played in sheltering Jews from the Nazis.
At this time of tension over Islam in America, there is so much more to understanding Islam.
Okay, so sorry it wasn't louder. I have it all the way up, so I'm not sure what that was about. But you heard them say that they protected Jewish people out of a religious obligation. So what's the source of that religious obligation? In the Islamic tradition, it teaches that those who follow the teachings of the previous prophets that I mentioned there and many others, that they are the same as us, that they are our brothers and sisters. That they all. The idea is that the message has always been the same. That there's only one God. There's a Creator, one sole Creator of the universe, and that's what essentially binds and unites us and creates an obligation and responsibility to protect one another. And so therefore, that has played out throughout history, most of history until recently. But it actually gets into the next myth, because I mentioned about Israel-Palestine. Many people view that as a conflict between Muslims and Jews, and actually it's a misrepresentation to say that. Because Israel is a nation state. It is a country with policies and laws. Not everybody is Jewish there. And Palestinian people, 20% of them are Christian. And 50% of Lebanese people are Christian. And so the people of the region aren't necessarily, Arab people aren't all Muslims. But we see this equation all the time. Like we hear the words Arab and Muslim used interchangeably as if they're the same thing. And of course, also not all Muslims are Arab. Does anybody know where the largest Muslim population in the world is?
Indonesia.
Indonesia. Does anybody know where the second largest is? Anybody? It's India. So even though Muslims are only 14% of India's population, they have 1.2 billion people, so it ends up being a lot of people. When you add Pakistan and Bangladesh, South Asia has a large number of Muslims. Does anybody know about what proportion of Muslims on the planet are Arab? Around. It's not a hard number. It's about 18 to 20%. So less than 1 in 5 Muslims are Arab. But we see these terms used interchangeably all the time, so it's important for us to understand that we're not talking about the same thing. There's an overlap, but they're not the same. And then finally, there's a perception that Islam is anti-American. And we see this idea that Islam is at odds with America, that you can't be Muslim and American at the same time. And Dr. Ben Carson said that to be American and Muslim is to be schizophrenic, which is offensive to people with serious mental health conditions, but also it's incredibly offensive to us too. But
offend.
yeah, you might as well get everybody, right? And there's been people who've been talking about Sharia, that Muslims want to impose Sharia on the rest of America, and want us to follow their laws, right? Now, Sharia is mostly something that's talked about among scholars, like most regular people. I've been around Muslims my whole life. You don't see people sitting around talking about Sharia very much, okay? It's mostly something talked about among scholars. And there are 4 major schools of thought. It's not necessarily law. What it is guidance. Guidance to interpret and understand the religion and apply it to your life, to your context. And so there's 4 major schools of thought. There's lots of other understandings. But it's really a guidance. And so you know what's part of Sharia? This is part of Sharia, right? So the idea that we're trying to impose Sharia on everybody else, right? We're less than 1% of the population of the United States. Like, you know what I haven't heard talking to America? I mean, I've been around American Muslims my whole life.
You know what I've never heard someone say? You know what we need to do? We need to impose Sharia on the rest of America. Like, that's not a thing. Like, I've never heard someone say that before. But the perception is out there. A couple years ago, the Public Religion Research Institute took a poll, and 56% of Americans said that Islam is at odds with American values. Who knows what that number is now? It's probably worse. So a little bit about religion and culture. A Christmas tree is not a religious symbol, right? At least not a Christian one, right? It's a cultural symbol, right? It can feel like a religious symbol sometimes for some people because it's tied to a religious holiday, but not everywhere that Christians live where they're big evergreen fir trees, right? So, and so the line between religion and culture can be really blurry for people. And that's true for Muslims all over the world as well. And so the religion creates this connection between all these people. We consider ourselves to be part of a global community or an ummah of brothers and sisters all around the world. We say Assalamu alaikum to one another, right? We can pray together. We have this common Arabic from our scripture to make references to. But we're still so different. There's all this variation because Muslims are of very different cultural backgrounds. And I have this visualized by 3 mosques or places of worship. So this mosque is in China. A lot of people don't realize that most of northwest China is Muslim. And I've actually been here. If you walk in, it's like a Chinese temple courtyard, and you'll see Arabic calligraphy from the Quran in the shape of a dragon, right? And so that's the way in which they're incorporating their culture into the religion, right? And when I went in to pray, it's all in Arabic, right? Our scriptures are in Arabic, so when we pray in Arabic, I understand what's going on. And then afterwards, we can't speak one word to each other, right? And so it speaks to how the religion creates this connection across all the vastly different people, but we're still so different at the same time. This is Mecca. This is the holy center of the Islamic world. This is the only place you'll see, well, first of all, this building right here is called the Kaaba. This is the building towards which Muslims all around the world are praying in the direction of, which is why this is the only place you'll see Muslims praying in a circle. Everywhere else, we're praying in a line, facing the direction of Mecca based on where we are in the world. And then this is Timbuktu in Mali, in West Africa, which used to be one of the intellectual centers of the world. You see how different the architecture and the clothing and so forth are. And so this creates lots of different interpretations and understandings of the religion, right? Let me give you an example, okay? So my family's from India originally, and you know, I was raised with my culture and my religion. And you know, I don't know if anybody's been to an Indian wedding, but it's a pretty elaborate thing. And you know, and like a lot, the bride's supposed to be really sad, right? She's supposed to look down, and she's going into the other family. It's like she takes the name of the other family, and it's like the whole ritual's like around she's going off into this other family, right? That's the okay. Now, a lot of my Muslim friends are converts, like white American and black American converts. And I had noticed that a lot of my Muslim female friends who were married to men had different last names from their spouses. And so I was about 26 years old at the time, and I asked my friend, I said, you know, why do you have a different last name from your husband? You know, I'm just trying to understand. She's like, well, that's the Islamic tradition. And I'm like, no, it's the woman going into the man's family. She's like, no, that's your culture. She's like, the Islamic tradition is 2 equal parties coming into agreement. It's not one person going to the other. And literally, at 26 years old, I'd never heard anyone say that before to me. Because for me, my religion and my culture were presented together, and what was religion, what was culture wasn't always clear to me, right? And so that's an example of how that can play out in different people's lives. I made reference to Islam and Christianity, but generally I want to make the point that generally Muslims are much more aware of the relationship between Islam and Christianity than vice versa, right? Because we're taught Islam in relationship to Christianity, right? Like I said, Jesus is a prophet in the Islamic tradition. There's tremendous references to it, and there's a lot of references to biblical stories in the Quran. And so we're taught this sense that we're connected to that history and that tradition. But there are some differences. Well, actually, I want to make tell you one story about how prevalent the knowledge amongst Muslims are. There's a well-known story amongst Muslims about the first followers of the Prophet Muhammad, who were under persecution in Arabia.
so he sent them away. He said, you know what, you'll be safe in Abyssinia, which is modern-day Ethiopia, which was a Coptic Christian kingdom. And he said, you'll be safe there. They went there, they were captured, they were brought to the king, and when he found out their beliefs, he said, your beliefs are the same as ours, you'll be able to freely practice your religion in our land. This is a widely known story amongst Muslims all over the world, right? And it speaks to how aware we are of that connection, that relationship. But at the same time, like I said, there are some differences. First of all, the main difference is around the conception of Jesus, at least in terms of most forms of Christianity. So the concept of the Trinity doesn't exist in the Islamic tradition, but that's also true in some Christian traditions as well. Also, some Christian traditions have missionary work, the idea of spreading the good news, right? This concept doesn't exist in the Islamic tradition either, and so you'll notice that around the world there isn't much effort or infrastructure or work, missionary work that's happening in different parts of the world by Muslims. Instead, we have this concept known as dawah, which is more to set an example. And so the idea of free will is incredibly important in the Islamic tradition. So the idea is that there's a phrase that says there's no compulsion in religion. And what that means is that one should only choose what they believe, not be forced to believe something other than what they believe. And so that's also a reason why we know that extremists who are trying to force people to be Muslim, that they're very much in conflict with these teachings in the Islamic tradition. So this is my attempt to put all of post-colonial theory in one PowerPoint slide. But this history is really important because, in our country we don't learn this history well enough. And this is a huge, gross overview, but it's really important to know that people in different parts of the world are very aware of this history and are aware of the history, particularly of their own land. And first of all, everybody should read Orientalism by Edward Said at some point in their life, which is about the distorted lens that Europe had towards Eastern cultures and sense of superiority, which justified the Crusades. And this is a map of the various waves of violence of Crusades directed towards Jews and Muslims in the Holy Land. But what's less talked about is the Reconquista, the reconquering of Spain. Spain was ruled by the Moors. They were African and Arab Muslims. Most advanced civilization in the history of the world at the time, ruled for 700 years, advances in mathematics, science, astronomy, so forth, pluralistic, inclusive of Christians, Jews, and other groups. And so what you'll see is this green territory of Moorish territory diminishes over time. Does anybody know what year the Reconquista was completed? Anyone? That's correct. The spring of 1492. So what happened later that year? Christopher Columbus, right? Right. So I want you to think about Columbus. I want you to think about the conquistadors that came to the Americas. Now, you have to understand, there was lots of propaganda that led to the removal of the Moors, mostly in Rome, from Rome. Various popes declared the Moors to be savages, dark-skinned, subhuman savages that needed to be ridded from Europe, right? That was the rhetoric, that was the propaganda that galvanized the energy to remove the Moors. This is when Europe was in the Dark Ages, mind you. Now, Columbus and the conquistadors, they came over here, and what did they call the indigenous people? Savages, right? The idea of the dark-skinned savage other was cultivated in the process of taking back Spain, right? Even though they were so advanced and smart and brilliant and amazing, right? And so, of course, this launched an era of colonialism in which Europeans went all over the world. We should all know the story. Post-colonialism, where countries, we're told that this is when countries got their independence. But actually what Europeans figured out is people didn't like to be ruled by them. So they appointed dictators, strategically divided ethnic groups, and forced various ethnic groups to share countries to make them politically unstable so they could continue to extract resources. And of course we also know the exportation and transportation horrifically of slave labor as well. And then what we don't talk about also very much is that after World War II, when Europe was decimated, the US essentially inherited the colonial history, primarily because we embarked in the era of neo-colonialism, in which we overthrew democratically elected governments, installed dictators in various places in the world. Alfred McCoy said, The US empire coincided with the decolonization and dissolution of half a dozen European empires that produced 100 new nations, more than half the independent nations on the planet today. And so US hegemony was being exercised not over colonies, but sovereignty was compromised, in fact, had transferred to the imperial power, but over independent nation states who had sovereignty. So you had an empire under the conditions that denied empire. So how do you exercise hegemony in a non-hegemonic world? You have to do it covertly. And that's what our country has done, is engage in covert wars and overt wars, quite honestly, over the last couple decades. And it's led them to a Muslim world that looks kind of like this. Now, we look at a world map and I'm like, okay, yeah, that makes about sense. So, you know, I look at the world map, it looks kind of like that. But if you looked at a map just over 100 years ago, it would have looked really different. Because you had Islamic civilizations like the Ottoman Empire that were much more prevalent. And in Islamic civilizations, you had large federations where people had freedom of movement and they could trade goods along vast territories. There was no such thing as a passport, right? There was no such thing as a nation state. And so Islamic empires, people could move. After the first couple hundred years, Islam spread primarily through trade. Silk Route in China, trans-Saharan trade routes of sub-Saharan Africa, and the Indian spice trades, right? So it explains kind of where Muslims live in the world. And so you have freedom of movement, and then all of a sudden, you have the creation of a bunch of these countries. So let's take a look at them. Afghanistan. Afghanistan was created by the British. They didn't want their crown jewel of India to share a border with China, which had not yet invaded Tibet yet. Which is the reason why there's this little strip of land in Afghanistan that sticks out like this. And every ethnic group in Afghanistan is split across two countries. That's not on accident, right? And it just so happens it's been incredibly politically unstable and hard to keep together and all these different kinds of things, right? For all these decades, and now the longest war in American history. It's still ongoing. Iraq, you may have heard of the Sunni Arabs, the Shia Arabs, and the Kurds who were forced to share this country, and Saddam Hussein, who ruled over it, who we supported and empowered and gave military aid to, and so he ruled over these groups, and we actually encouraged him to invade Iran in the 80s because they overthrew a dictator that we had supported and that was giving us oil for cheap. You may have heard of the Iran oil embargo. So when they overthrew that dictator, the United States didn't like that, so we encouraged them to invade Iran. And we actually fueled both sides of that war, if you ever learned about the Iran-Contra affair. And so, of course, we invaded Iraq a couple times after that as well. And then there's countries like Egypt. We supported a dictator for 30 years, gave him billions of dollars. His name was Hosni Mubarak. That led to the Arab Spring and 2 coups that happened earlier this decade. And then, of course, there's Saudi Arabia, which was just Arabia. And if you know the story of Lawrence of Arabia, you know that the British empowered this marginal group known as the House of Saud to fight the Ottomans. And they said that if you win, which they didn't think they would win, but they said, look, if you win, there's this black stuff in the sand, and it's going to make you rich, and we'll buy it from you. So for the last 100 years, the holy center of the Islamic world has been ruled by this particular group of people, who have a very particular interpretation of Islam, known as Wahhabism, which is incredibly literalist, conservative Islamic interpretation. So I would say that it's comparable to very rigid evangelical Christianity. Now, you have to understand, millions of people go and do pilgrimage here, and I've experienced this myself. You go there, you get bombarded with their pamphlets and their materials and their interpretations of the Quran and so forth and so on. And actually, they also build schools in all these different places in the world too. They really propagate their interpretation of Islam to Muslims. And you have to think that a lot of these people who come to do pilgrimage here, or when Saudi goes to somewhere to teach what they think, first of all, they have resources. And a lot of people in these post-colonial realities are poor, right? So they're getting resources. And Islam started here. So many people think maybe we should listen to them. They should probably understand Islam better than we do. So we should listen to them more, right? So over the last 100 years, you've had a more rigidness to the interpretation of Islam relative to before that, when the pilgrimage was like a world conference. You had people coming from all these different places, wrestling with big spiritual questions. Now, scholars who challenge their interpretation of Islam in Saudi Arabia are killed, right? And so that kind of exploration of the spiritual exploration that you saw for centuries upon centuries is now really not as prevalent, especially in that part of the world. The history of Islam in America is longer than people realize too. There's emerging research on West African Muslims who came to the Americas before Europeans, but that's still emerging. But we definitely know was the first documented Muslim was a Moor brought as a slave by the Spanish to Florida named Esteban in 1527 AD. 20 to 25% of all enslaved Africans brought to British North America were Muslim. And 40.7% came from Muslim-ruled territories of Africa, in which Islam was part of the ethos of the culture. Historians have found churches where slaves were secretly practicing their various faith traditions. Some of them are oriented towards Mecca, where they found secret compartments with prayer beads and prayer rugs inside, where people were secretly practicing Islam. And we also know that there was a couple islands. There's some islands off the coast of Georgia and South Carolina, known as the Sapelo Islands. You may have heard of the Gullah people. They were Muslims. They killed their slave masters. They lived in autonomy on these islands until the early 20th century. And they maintained echoes of Islamic practices and traditions into the early 20th century. But what's more known is the emergence of non-Orthodox forms of Islam, known by people like Noble Drew Ali, who starts something called the Moorish Science Temple. But of course, the most known was the Nation of Islam, first started by a man named Farad Muhammad, who taught a man named Elijah Poole, who became Elijah Muhammad, who taught Malcolm X. And Malcolm X became a global figure and eventually converted to Sunni Orthodox Islam. And with that, hundreds of thousands of African Americans became Muslims. Prior to the 1980s, overwhelmingly the majority of Muslims in this country were African American. The only others were, for the most part, Arabs, who've been coming here for over 100 years. You had to be white to immigrate to the United States, and people from Lebanon and Syria were able to slide in on those policies. And so they went to places like Dearborn, Michigan. And then in the 1960s, you had a change in the immigration laws, which allowed people from other parts of the world to come here. And so now we have this incredibly diverse Muslim community in America, and that's how my family got here. That's how a number of families. And you know, American Muslims were doctors, were comedians, were hip hop artists, were engineers. But one of the most famous Americans of all time, Muhammad Ali, rest in peace, is of course Muslim. And so I want to show you a video to lift up the voices of American Muslims.
I look to the right and all I gaze upon reveals the source of flowers, rainbows, and the dew at dawn. Some see before and some see in and some see after. I let my sight pierce the chains and see the master. I wanna live in a land called paradise. I wanna go to the valley of the king. I wanna live in a land called paradise. Wanna see the birds fly, I wanna hear the angels sing. So many times in my life I ask myself the question, what got me, brought me into all this mess I'm swimming in? But pain is not a neither harm in the pool of bliss. So slap me with your hand or kiss me with your softest kiss. Tell me that you love me or that you don't like me now. Tell me you invite me or that you don't want me around. I won't cry over a world that can't change my life. I'll put my money on what lies ahead in paradise. I wanna live in a land called paradise. I wanna go anything and a mind full of God. I'm pleased and good and happy and harm, and now I realize that I already live in a land called paradise. I wanna live in a land called paradise. I wanna go to the valley of the King. I wanna live in a land called paradise. Wanna see the birds fly, I wanna hear the angels. I wanna live in a land called paradise. I wanna go to the valley of the King. I wanna live in a land called paradise. Wanna see the birds fly, I wanna hear the angels sing. Wanna hear the angels sing. Oh, oh.
Okay, so a few years ago, Time magazine asked if America is Islamophobic. I used to have an answer for this, but then someone sent me this photo and I thought I answered it for me. These were actually next to each other on a newsstand. And the whole thing about like President Obama being a secret Muslim, what most people were like, no, he's a Christian, but what people weren't saying was, so what if he was a Muslim? Like, why is it a problem to be a Muslim in America, right? And that was a very clear, the messages are much more clear now about all the people's problems with Muslims now, but back then it was like, this was a big deal, like, oh, this is a clear message that people don't like Muslims. So a little bit about me, I grew up as a kid, it was before 9/11, I grew up in Ohio, and a lot of people used to ask, what's a Muslim? Like a lot of people had never even heard of it before. There was vandalism in our mosque. I was constantly being proselytized and told I was going to go to hell if I didn't accept Jesus. I could just be standing at a bus stop and that would happen. So my experience with most white people was that being Muslim was foreign or strange. Like, oh, you don't eat pork, and like, you don't drink, you don't date, that's weird. Whereas my experience with black people was more like, yeah, we know, my uncle's Muslim. Like everybody had a Muslim uncle somewhere in their family, so it was like, it's like, yeah, we can't eat pork when he comes over. So, so that was kind of the experience that I had. But it was this constant foreigner experience. You get asked, where are you from? No, I'd say I'm from Ohio. No, where are you really from? It's like this, I need this explanation for why you look the way you look. And also, you hardly have an accent. I'm like, I don't know what to tell you. This is how people in Ohio talk, so I don't know what you're expecting, but again, it's just this foreign and otherizing, and it really calls into question, who do we include in this idea of being American? So 9/11 happened. There was a sudden focus on our community. There's been hate crimes, threats, and harassments, essentially perpetually since then. It's as bad as it's ever been right now, though. There's been surveillance, investigations. I've experienced some iteration of all these things in either directly or in my surrounding circles. We were expected to apologize for 9/11, which, we're American. 9/11 happened to us. My brother his family lived in Manhattan. We were really scared for their safety that day. It turned, we ended up finding out that he was actually treating victims. He's a doctor. He was treating victims at the hospital he worked at that day. But, the cell phone towers were down. We couldn't get a hold of them. We were very worried. So it's really weird to feel like, for people to make you feel like you have to apologize for something that happens to you, that you have nothing to do with and that you can't relate to at all, and that you would find important. So it's an odd experience. And as a community, we weren't that prepared for a response, because we went from this group that was relatively unknown in this country to this group with all the suspicion around us. And then after 9/11, we had the passing of the Patriot Act, which is still in effect today, which means it suspends habeas corpus. And this impacts all Americans. If you were deemed to be an enemy combatant, you can be held indefinitely without access to a lawyer, without being charged with anything. You can just disappear. And this happens in our community periodically. Sometimes this happened to a doctor in Ohio, in the community that I grew up in, when he went to go see relatives in Canada. He disappeared for 4 months. 3 of those months we didn't know where he was. And so you can imagine the kind of fear that creates in our community. A lot of people say that there should be racial profiling around Islamophobia, or around Muslims. what's the racial profile? You know, like I showed you how diverse Muslims are. There is no profile, right? We look all different kinds of ways, so it makes no sense. And my worst experiences has been coming back into the country. Now I get the X, you know, on the little thing when you come back in. I get it every time now, so I get the extra whatever. But some of my worst experiences of racial profiling have been coming back in the country, them going through all my stuff, interrogating me, asking me all these questions. Many men in my family have experienced things like this, but I've experienced it a lot. All the men in my family have been on a flight watch list at some point. My brother's nephews, my brother's sons, from the time they were 6 years old, were on flight watch lists. You couldn't fly on the day of a flight with them because they wouldn't get cleared, so you'd have to go a day in advance to get them cleared. So these are just like little things that are essentially just normal. They're just like part of our reality. They're just not unusual in our community whatsoever. A few years ago, there was a whole Ground Zero mosque controversy, which was not at Ground Zero and not a mosque. It was based on the Jewish Community Center of New York. It was an interfaith effort, actually. And the Jewish Community Center of New York was based on the YMCA. So people went buck wild crazy over a Muslim YMCA. On a site that used to be a Burlington coat factory. I'm like, this isn't hollow ground, y'all. Like, I literally got a coat from there when I was a kid. I'm like, there ain't nothing special about it, you know. But a lot of people think Islamophobia is a partisan issue. More than half of Democrats were against it. The Anti-Defamation League came out against it, right? And so there's this fervor. But okay, there's one incident, so what, right? Okay, there's one incident. But there's been opposition to our community centers and places of worship all over the country, and there's been attacks on them as well, consistently all over the country. We've also had congressional hearings targeting our community, entitled "The Extent of Radicalization of the American Muslim Community and That Community's Response." And during that hearing, the first Muslim congressperson, Keith Ellison, gave emotional testimony about Salman Hamdani, who was an EMT who went into the towers, saving people's lives for the NYPD and the fire department. And he died on 9/11. He was one of hundreds of Muslims that died on 9/11. There are a lot of Muslims that died on 9/11 because there's a lot of Muslims that live in that part of New York City, live and work in that part of New York City. We also have profiteers, people who make money demonizing Muslims. What was it, like 8 years ago, there was a guy named, or I guess 7 years ago, there was a guy named Pastor Terry Jones who did Burn a Quran Day, and he got a lot of media attention, but he's actually still out there. I lived in Michigan for a long time. He used to show up outside of mostly Arab high schools and protest saying that there were terrorists inside. And he would get media attention locally in Michigan. Still going on strong. But this person's probably the worst of them all. Pamela Geller, she gets access to media. But look at these subway signs she puts up. In any war between the civilized man and the savage, support the civilized man. Where does that language come from? Right? It's old language, right? There's a particular reason why people use language like that, right? Because it has a certain kind of resonance. Kind of like the America First language right now, which we know has a resonance around anti-Semitism. You should also know that the NYPD had a surveillance program of every Muslim student association, every Muslim place of worship and community center, and many Muslim-owned businesses throughout the entire Northeast Seaboard. Not just in New York City, but which calls the question, what is the jurisdiction of a police department? But they also spent millions of dollars on this program. Does anybody know how many leads they came up with? Anyone? Zero, exactly. From 18 months after 9/11 until about 2.5 years ago, 0 leads. And so I want to show you a quick video regarding this.
Oh, hey, I didn't see you there. You know, if you're like most Americans, you probably say to yourself all the time, systemic racism. Is that really a thing? Well, you probably know that today's technology lets the government watch what we do and track where we go more than ever before, so much that privacy is almost a thing of the past. But did you know that the government watches some of us a lot more than others, depending on where we come from? That as recently as 2011, the NYPD was exposed for targeting their surveillance specifically at what they call ancestries of interest. That they've been using our tax dollars to spy on these people's everyday lives, just going to the barber shop and the bookstore and singling them out for constant invasion of privacy for no other reason than where their ancestors were born? Did you know that? Do you know what that's called? That's called systemic racism. And yes, it's really a thing.
Okay, so yeah, our community has been subjected to a lot, continue to be subjected to a lot. You may also remember the story of Ahmed, the 13-year-old boy who brought a clock to school and was arrested. Now, many people thought this was a feel-good story at the end because President Obama said that, oh, he's the kind of a kid we want, someone who's interested in math and science. What a lot of people don't realize is that after the cameras went away, his family received so many death threats that they left the country. They literally don't live in the United States anymore because they feared for their lives so much. The community that is subjected to the most hate crimes as a percentage of their population is the American Sikh community, which of course is a completely different religious tradition that originates from northern India. They are targeted mostly because they're brown, usually, and also because as part of the faith tradition, men keep their hair in turbans because people don't cut their hair as part of the tradition. And now in this environment of mass shootings that we've had, we all know the names, right? Newtown, Aurora, Tucson, now Las Vegas, right? We never include this in this incident that happened in Wisconsin a few years ago on that list of mass shootings, where this man went in and cold-blooded killed all these people in their temple while they were praying, right? And we don't call this person a terrorist, right? Because we've racialized what it means to be a terrorist, right? So this person is a terrorist, right? But the Orlando shooter is. And this person isn't, and that person is. So, and show me what the difference is, right? And I believe we didn't really spend time mourning the loss of these lives the same way. We haven't, as seared in our consciousness the way these other incidents do, because I don't believe we value the loss of this life the same way. And I think that's the reason why it's not included. And it was the only place that President Obama didn't show up to speak and to mourn with the family as he did with the others. Hindu Americans have also been subjected to hate. My former student at University of Michigan, Nina Davaluri, was the first South Asian winner of Miss America. She was bombarded with a bunch of hateful tweets. This is Miss America, not Miss Terrorist, hashtag it on the screen. Are you serious? The Arab wins? This is Miss America, not Miss Arabia. So we're just all thrown together. It's like just, okay, is this because of her religion? No, it's just because she's a brown woman, that's it, right? And so we're all just kind of thrown together, Arab, South Asian, Indian, whatever, it doesn't matter. It's just all the same thing. And actually, Hindus have been really been targeted a lot more lately. Again, being perceived as Muslims, there's been a lot of incidences in which Hindus have been attacked or murdered, and, including in last year there was an incident that did end up getting reported nationally in Kansas City, and one of my friends who I grew up with lives like right around the corner from there and frequents the establishment that they were at, and was thinking about going there that night with his family and chose not to, went to a different establishment instead. I'm not going to go into all the details about the 2016 election. I don't think it's worth rehashing with that level of detail. I think we all know that the announcement of banning Muslims and all sorts of other crazy stuff happened in that election. And we're since living in the wake of that election and some of the policies and efforts to try to live up to some of that. We had the emergence of some voices like the Gold Star family, Khizr and Ghazala Khan, who tried to speak up against this un-American Muslim ban that has occurred. But I also wanted to show you how politicized it is, because I want you to pay attention to which countries were banned. And you may have heard about this, but not one person in the United States has been killed in our homeland from any of these countries by a terrorist. Not one. You know which country has? Saudi Arabia. which has a very cozy relationship with the United States, right? And it's actually been thousands, right? And so it's interesting how that is conveniently left out, but yet all these other countries are focused on as part of that. Of course, Iraq got itself taken out of it because of all the people that had helped America in finally for the most part, winning the Iraq War. How many of you knew that last year there was a bombing of a mosque in Minnesota? Okay, this is the most I've ever seen in a group. You know, usually most people haven't even heard about this, right? Where's the wall-to-wall coverage? You know, so it's like, you have to remember that it can feel so, like, overwhelmingly the vast majority of terrorist attacks in the United States are done by white men, right? And I think, I'm trying to remember, I have the number, I'm just forgetting it right now. It's like, it's something like, it's over half, for sure, okay? And the thing is that we don't get wall-to-wall coverage of all those incidences, right? And so, but when one incident occurs that involves a Muslim, it's wall-to-wall coverage, right? And so it feels like there's a lot of it going on, right? But actually, as a population, American Muslims commit less crime than any other demographic in this country, by far. It's actually weird how little crime we do, right? It's just that when somebody does something, it's everywhere, right? And right now, the targeting of Muslims is as bad as it's ever been. And so we're seeing these massive rises, like exponential rises in hate crimes, bias incidences, and violence directed at Muslims. And so from 2014 to 2016, which was during election season, you saw a 584% increase in Muslims being targeted. And so I don't think it's overdramatic to invoke this very famous poem as I wrap up from World War II, in which it says, they first came for the communists and I didn't speak up because I wasn't a communist. Then they came for the trade unionists because I didn't speak up because I wasn't a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews and I didn't speak up because I wasn't a Jew. And then they came for me. By that time, there was no one left to speak up. So our community, we need allies, we need people to stand up. I was heartened by all the people that showed up at the airports last year around the travel ban. But we're less, like I said, we're less than 1% of the population of this country. We need people to speak out because our voices are lost. People don't hear us because I can't tell you how many times people told me, why don't Muslims speak out against terrorism? I'm like, we have been. The whole time, like the entire time, you know what I mean? And it's like, but again, if you notice in media, there's lots of people talking about us, but very few times are we able to talk about ourselves, right? And including people like Bill Maher, and you notice that I included Bill Maher in this slide here, right? Who's one of the biggest, he's a liberal, who's one of the biggest Islamophobes in our media, right? He's a big on that. He's big on having ignorant people talk about Muslims in really overgeneralized ways. So it's something that we need to pay attention to. These are some resources as we move into Q&A that I'll keep them up. And I just want to thank you all for being here and thank you for your time. Appreciate the opportunity. Want to take the microphone around? And I'll come down for the Q&A now that I don't have to read by the computer.
Yeah, so I know we're getting close to the end time, but if anyone wants to stick around for afterward, that'd be fantastic for any comments or questions that you had for Dr. Ahmed. But if we can just give a quick round of applause for this awesome presentation. I hope that you guys are really impressed. I did from this presentation, I took a lot from it, and I really enjoyed it, so thank you very much. So if you have any questions, raise your hand, and I can come around with the mic for you guys to ask it.
Hey, I thought your rap was super dope.
Oh, thanks.
Do you have like stuff like that on YouTube?
Probably. I have an album, I can give it to you. I'll give it.
That works good too?
I think I have a copy. I think I have one copy with me. Let me just see.
Yeah, so
You'll be the magic winner of that. Yeah, there it is. Boom. There it is. That was not planned. literally, it just happened to be in my bag, so there you go. Yeah.
So when I saw you do the rap, I just want to know like what artists you think are the best at like doing that type of music.
Well, just great question because my dissertation is about Islam and Black Americans related to hip hop. So really, really great question. And I have a lot of friends who are really amazing artists. So I'm going to name artists that you probably don't know that aren't famous. Well, they are with the people that love them. But I first want to tell you about Maimouna Youssef, who's a really good friend of mine out of DC. She also goes by Move with Fresh. She tours with Common. She's a really amazing artist. Really, really think that if you get a chance to just, again, go on YouTube or wherever, check her out. There's a group called The Reminders that I really like, out of Colorado. I mean, but in terms of like people that you know, I mean, Lupe Fiasco was one of those cats. I mean, he's, you know, I don't know, he kind of fell off, I thought, but you know, he was amazing for many years. You know, Mos Def, Yasin Bey, these are all like Muslim hip hop artists that have been in the mainstream. A lot of people didn't really even realize that they were Muslim. And so, Tribe Called Quest. So there's actually, I don't even know why I'm focused on Muslim hip hop artists, but that's, you know, but in terms of my research and what I actually wrote about in my dissertation, I really focused on these kinds of artists who use their voice for political and social, but also for spiritual exploration. Dave Chappelle's another one. I mean, he's not a hip hop artist, but he kind of is. You know, he's a hip hop comedian, I guess. And so, you know, we have these voices out there, you know, but a lot of times people don't even know that they're Muslim. And actually, they are intentional. I've interviewed a lot of these people, and they're intentional about not sharing because they're concerned about their safety and about the consequences for their career and so forth. So they kind of more just like weave it into their art and kind of hope certain people catch it. So people who are Muslim, like when we hear it, we're like, oh, okay, he's making these references. Okay, but yeah, I mean, you know, but even artists who aren't Muslims, who are, you know, out there right now, like Kendrick and all these people who are speaking about the political and social moment, they're all speaking to these issues that are going on right now. And so I'm a big advocate for it, and so that's the reason why, for me, it's part of my life, so that's why I try to share, you know, my aspect and contribution of that too as well. Did I answer your question? I wasn't. Okay, all right.
Anyone else?
Oh, and I really like Childish Gambino, by the way. I like listening to him nonstop. Oh, okay.
So basically, yesterday when I my commute, and I left my lights on in my car, and my battery died. I was trying to go home, and I was like, oh, this kind of sucks. And then there was like a car battery, campus police center, and like I don't know how to I've never done this before, so I know then I saw like Saudi Arabian student like walking in the parking lot. He was like the only one, and I asked him like, hey, do you know how to just start a car? And he's like, yeah, and he did it for me, and I thought that was like a really great experience. Because I learned how to do that, and then also the fact that you were just very helpful and it's great. Do you have any person come up to you and say they had a great experience with
Yeah, that happens a lot actually, and it's interesting. Yeah, a lot of people feel like they want to come to me and tell me I had this great experience with a Muslim person, and that's cool because that makes me happy, you know, because there's other people who. Sometimes when people say, hey, I met this Muslim person, I'll get worried because sometimes people have bad experiences, and then some people will want to share those experiences too. So, and my thing is that it's people. It's people. Some people are amazing people, some people aren't. It probably isn't about the fact that they're Muslim or not. It's just about who they are, you know. I mean, if they're good people, maybe it's obviously Islam probably influenced why they're a good person, but you know. In my experience with human beings, there's all different kinds of people in all different kinds of communities. So, yeah, and I don't want you all to think that when I was criticizing Saudi Arabia, I was talking about generally people. I was just talking about the regime. So, but, sorry. Was there anything else you want to share?
No, just basically like, I just admire the fact that like English isn't their first language, and then they come here to study, and then they have to like learn everything. It's a lot harder for them. It just takes a lot of like courage for them to do that.
Especially right now. It takes a lot of courage. If you don't know, international student numbers in this country are like crazy down. This is probably the lowest enrollment in years we've ever had of international students in America. Because there's a lot of fear to come to America right now, especially for Muslim countries, for Muslims.
Your comment kind of leads to one of my questions. How can we as a community, either on a person-to-person level, classmates, administrators, or on a more administrative level, in light of these messages that are happening in our country at the moment, what are important ways and kind of takeaways that you think we can make this a safe place for students?
Yeah, right now is not a time of subtlety. So if you consider yourself an ally or someone who wants to make a community, and in this case LaSalle College, a place that is inclusive for all different kinds of people, especially people who are particularly being targeted these days, which is almost everybody, it feels like. But you know, I think it's not a time to just to be silent in your advocacy and in your support. It's a time to organize, it's a time to make vocal and visible and not subtle the fact that you welcome people, that you support people, that you want to be, you know, it's a time to show up to programs that make a difference for, you know, if there's some kind of cultural program or something like that. Even, it doesn't have to be political all the time. It can just be, but I don't think, look, there's an organization, some of you may have heard of it, it's called Showing Up for Racial Justice, or SURJ, S-U-R-G-J. The reason why it's called that is because sometimes it's just about showing up, literally with your body in space, and making people feel like, wow, okay, there's other people, there's actually people who want me here. They care enough to show up, and that matters. And you don't even have to use your voice. Sometimes it's just, again, just about showing up and paying attention. What's going on around me? What can I go to? What can I be at? What can I participate in that can help people feel like we want them here, that we welcome them as part of our community? Yeah, sorry.
So, along the lines of what you're saying, sometimes you just encounter a lot of ignorance from people, but not any willingness to learn. And kind of sometimes I think of that story of the guy at the beach throwing starfish back into the beach, back onto the beach, and the person asking why are you doing this? They're all going to die anyway. Well, it matters to that one starfish.
Right.
And sometimes I will engage people who are being ignorant because I think it matters to that one person. But sometimes you feel like it's hopeless. They're never gonna change their mind, no matter what you say. I guess I'm wondering, how do you make the distinction?
So this is actually, you give me actually a very natural way of talking about, for me, how being Muslim directly ties into my activism and my place as an educator and so forth. Remember I said that, you know, we have this idea of no compulsion in religion, and in Islam that you shouldn't force someone to believe. So I think for me as a Muslim, it has taught me that you shouldn't try to force anybody to believe anything other than what they believe. We can influence each other, and one of the most powerful things that we have is the power of example, which is what that concept of dawah that I was talking about is about, is the power of example. I've literally had people come up to me after this talk or other talks and say to me that yeah, you gave a great presentation, but honestly the most powerful thing that I got from being here was just seeing you as a reasonable human being who identifies as Muslim. Because for a lot of people, they just haven't seen or experienced that. And for me, I'm like, what the hell? I just did a whole bunch of things right there, and that's all you took away? But at the same time, I was like, well, for that person, that's what they needed, and that's what resonated with them, and that's what moved them. And, you know, and I can't control where that person's at. And so I just think that that's a big thing that we need to be thinking about as social justice educators and activists right now, because there's a lot of people trying to make, so, you know, I call it your generation woke. And, you know, it's a lot of woke people trying to like make other people woke. I'm gonna make you woke. And it's like, you know, people actually oftentimes get like kind of like, whoa, like, you know, people are where they're at. And just because someone's not there right now doesn't mean that they're not going to be there tomorrow or somewhere else tomorrow, right? But the question is, how do we move people from there over time in the right direction? Is it like hitting them over the head with stuff they're not ready for and making them feel bad and stupid for not knowing or not feeling or thinking or agreeing with us right now? Or is it about meeting people where they're at and being like, okay, you know, and I'm not saying don't go out and advocate and whatever. We need people to do that. But there's also something to be said about just being patient with people and recognizing that just because they don't believe or they're not where you're at, they don't care about the things, it doesn't mean that that they will never be able to at some point. And in the meantime, find people who can affirm you in what you believe and what you care about, because, you know, we need that validation as well. So if we put all the energy to people that aren't gonna, it just gets sapped away, right? It goes away. So how do we build that strength so that we can influence people and still have plenty left over to do the kind of advocacy and the fighting for what we believe in that we care about. Thank you. That's a great question. Anyone else?
Can I just say one thing? Yeah.
And then there's this person in the front.
I really love to talk. I just have to say something with all this talk about allies and stuff. What's your name with the light blue shirt? Willie. I just want to go on the record and say I'm so impressed with you standing up and saying what you did. I just thought that was really important. I met someone, unlike anyone I've ever met before. I found he was a really good and intelligent person. I learned a lot. I just thought that was really, I just thought it was great. One of the best things that happened today. Not that you're stuff. Wow, I want you to know.
That's all they had to do? No.
That was great. I hope more students do things like what you just did. That takes a lot of courage. It's great.
Thank you for that. I appreciate that.
Someone else up here.
It was, yeah.
Hello? Okay. So I don't really have a question. Well, I do. It's a quick question on who wrote that book about Orientalism?
Edward Said, S-A-I-D.
Okay, let me get that last name. And while I'm here, I would like to say that I really like how you approach like the historical background of things. I felt like it was very beautiful once I learned more about it, because there's a lot that I did not know. It was kind of more of a general, muddled, like information that I did have, but no one has ever gone into detail that way. And it's very inspiring and just awesome to see. So I kind of wanted to leave you with that before I get to class. So thank you.
Thank you. And also, it's also about whose perspective we've been given through our education. You know, like from whose lens have we been taught a lot of these things. So some of the things we knew, but it was presented from a dominant culture lens oftentimes, usually. They say history is written by the victor. And so a lot of us who are tied into communities and ancestries that have been subject to that have been basically taught from the lens of the dominant group. And so basically that's the point of post-colonial theory and critical theory in the academy, is to really question those dominant narratives. And can we reframe and look at things from a different perspective and realize that there's a broader truth to anything that we're presented, which is why we need not diversity in every single kind of way in our education system, so that we can challenge one another and realize there is no single absolute truth to any of these inquiries that we're doing in the higher education system.
Thank you, that's beautifully said. And we'd like to thank all of you for attending today. I think this is a great discussion. I took a lot out of it. I hope you all did. Thank you all for your questions. And again, thank you, Dr. Ahmed.